I think the current online intellectual space could benefit more from being more nuanced and grounded. So in this video, I'm gonna add a bit more nuance to the concept of high agency that has been popularized in the entrepreneurial slash self-help community. So this term high agency is coined by Eric Weinstein when he was on Tim Ferriss podcast in 2016. The thing is, Eric didn't give us a definition. He only dabbled a bit on the characteristics of a high agency individual. The thing is, this term is so vague, and different people, when they hear it, they would understand it slightly differently. George Mack, who, as I understand, created a whole website called highagency.com to talk about this whole framework. He also doesn't give us the definition either. He just said that high agency is one of those you know it when you see it ideas. George, on his website, has a model of a tricycle to explain that high agency is a combination of bias to action, clear thinking, and disagreeability. But his article also seems to involve every single trait and mindset that can make a person successful. This is just a lot. If you read the page on highagency.com, it's just very long. This is too much. And as a low agency person, I'll probably able to do all these things after I reincarnate twice. And you know when something is so broad, it's easy for you to use it to describe whatever you want. And at some point, the concept loses its meaning. An equivalence of this is to say, be authentic. Until now, I still don't know what it means to be authentic. I want this video to be a constructive criticism of a concept because I think as a low agency person, I would know if something is helpful for me to become maybe a bit more higher agency. I don't know. And so when I heard the term high agency, immediately I thought of having control over your actions. Even though I don't think everything needs to be pinned down by definitions, I will still try to draw a scope around this concept. High agencies seem to describe people who make the impossible possible, who stand out in the crowd, who write their own story, who go against the grain. They are resourceful and creative problem solvers. They persevere, they outcome oriented. These people happen to life instead of life happens to them. This concept emerges from the understanding that most people unconsciously accept the external limitations. And in a nutshell, using my uneducated, untrained understanding in psychology, I would say that high agency is the combination of high disagreeableness, high industriousness, and high intelligence. It actually fits pretty well with George tricycle. Now, this concept is true to a certain extent, and I'm pretty sure many people will be benefited from hearing about it, especially me. But this whole agency thing doesn't sit right with me for some reason. I'm not going to critique it through the route of saying, oh, it ignores the inherent systemic inequality and oppression, and it's hyper-individualistic, and it ignores social cohesion. I wouldn't go through that route because it's too boring. And it also misses the point. I will critique it by answering or by analyzing if these traits really are essential to success. George shows this picture to illustrate the difference between a low and high agency individuals. Dude, How can we know which one of these two guys have the better strategy? This picture only makes sense if in hindsight we know that there's land not far away from the high agency guy and there are no planes coming by in the next 7 days for the other guy. Right? This high agency framework implies that there's no such thing as unsolvable problems if solving it doesn't defy the law of physics. So I took this from the from George's website. Well, I agree that many problems can be solved by creative solutions. But I also think that the hardest and most poignant problems in society are those that any solution would imply a triumph for certain values and compromise of the others. And a lot of the times the question is not about what are the solutions, but it's more about what are we willing to sacrifice. For example, how can you have a free market of thing A and an equal access to thing A at the same time? Sometimes we want both, right? Another example is how can we have a more flexible and reactive institution while also demands it to have all the checks and balances necessary? It's quite hard. Maybe this framework can be applied mostly for technical issues, but I would say that the hardest and the most common problems in everyday life of most people are interpersonal. These problems involve other people, so it's much harder to solve by just charging ahead, just do things on your own agency, right? Of course, you can be creative to find a solution that can be win-win for everybody. But I would say that a lot of times the right skill to have is to live with the problem and move on to focus on something else. The most useful thing I could take away from this concept of high agency is to take action. The rest, not too much. Going against the grain might set you aside from the majority, but most of the times, scientific discoveries are built on the shoulders of many nameless contributions. Creative solutions, most of the time, are the mix and match of other strategies that have been proven to be successful. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel, If this whole concept is to help people with low agency like me, telling them to do such drastic thing is not really helpful. Maybe just tell them to, hey, look around, see what other successful people are doing and do the same. This high agency framework also has a survival bias, I would say. How many people who have the same traits tried to do the impossible, tried to charge forward regardless, and failed? We have no idea how many of them. It's actually harder to know if you're persevering or you're banging your head against the wall. Creative problem solving and being conscientious will definitely make a person more likely to be successful. But I feel like the people who are popularizing the high agency idea emphasize a bit more on disagreeability. Why? Because they also realize that creative problem solving requires intelligence, and you can't just tell somebody with average intelligence to be more intelligent. And of course, certain problem solving skills can be learned by being exposed to similar problems over and over again. That's what I think more helpful advice for low agency people like me is to say, take actions and be consistent, and probably sprinkle some growth mindset on top. I think it's more grounded and it's more manageable. I guess what I have problem with high agency, not so much about the advice, because I think the advice is very valuable for me, but it's how it's called. High agency. Why do you call it high agency? High agency sounds like your mind has control over your actions and your outcomes, like you have more free will and consciousness than other people. It sounds a bit pretentious to me. When Chris Williams asked Eric Weinstein to elaborate more on this concept of high agency, Eric basically spent 10 minutes to just say that he and his son are the epitome of high agency. Don't you think it's a bit cringe? There are people who are born naturally disagreeable, and it requires more agency, more effort, more work for them to become more agreeable. Some people also are born with very high conscientiousness, so it's much harder for them to just sit down and chill and enjoy the things for a little bit to avoid burnout. I think high agency should be more about becoming a more rounded and adaptive individual, because trying to go beyond a certain set of characteristics that you possess needs a lot of intention and agency and work and time. Every personality and trait has its vice and virtue. Have you ever heard about evolution? Have you ever heard about the survival of the fittest? So it's not that we all live in a vacuum, but your traits have to fit with the culture, with the environment around you, so that you can be more successful. Have you ever heard about the dinosaurs? They used to be the strongest. They used to be invincible. They lived for 100-something million years and they gone extinct. But you know what have survived evolution? Koala, sloths, pandas. I think that's all I have for today. I need to go to bed.